U.S. Trotskyism, the Shachtmanite Tradition After Shachtman by Robert J. Alexander. By the time the majority of the members of the Independent Socialist League joined the Socialist Party Social Democratic Federation in the latter months of 1958, most of them, including Max Shachtman himself, were no longer Trotskyists. They had become democratic socialists or social democrats. Nevertheless, the ideas which had been developed in connection with the Shachtmanite split in the Socialist Workers' Party by no means ceased being an ideological strain within American Trotskyism. The conviction that the Soviet Union and the other countries which had come under Communist Party Stalinist control subsequent to World War II were not in any sense, quote, workers' states, end quote, continued to be held by many who still considered themselves Trotskyists. Within a few years after the disappearance of the Independent Socialist League, this ideological trend in American Trotskyism had again found organizational form. Indeed, a loose-knit, quote, international socialist, end quote, tendency with the non-worker state orientation had developed, as we note in another chapter. However, within this tendency of American and international Trotskyism, there developed sharp differences of opinion, definition, and interpretation. Some elements held to the bureaucratic collectivism theory which had been developed by Shachtman and others, but there were also those who adopted one version or another of the view that the Communist Party-controlled regimes were, quote, state capitalist, end quote, in nature. The International Socialists. The emergence of the International Socialists. Among those Independent Socialist League, I believe that's what the name is. Independent Socialist League. I thought so. Among those Independent Socialist League leaders and members who opposed entry into the Socialist Party Social Democratic Federation were a number who submitted to the decision of the majority and joined the SPSDF in spite of their dislike of the idea. At least some of these people continued to regard themselves as Trotskyists. Within the Socialist Party Social Democratic Federation, they recruited a few people to their point of view, particularly from among the youth who had never been Trotskyists of any description before. One of the leading figures in the Independent Socialist League, who had been against entry into the Socialist Party Social Democratic Federation, was Hal Draper, the longtime leader of the left wing of the Independent Socialist League. I have some pieces by Hal Draper and on Hal Draper on the channel, if you're interested. It was around him that the revival of what can broadly be called, quote, Shachtmanism, end quote, developed. Also of interest would be the piece by Julius Jacobson titled The Two Deaths of Max Shachtman. Draper had described the origins of the new Trotskyist tendency. He has written that, quote, it began in 1964 as a political continuation or reaction of the independent socialist tendency which had been represented by the Independent Socialist League. In 1964, I took the initiative in forming the first independent socialist club in Berkeley. Within the course of the following year, a second independent socialist club was formed in Berkeley, one on campus, one in the city, and in the Independent Socialist Club in New York. I believe Lauren Goldner was part of one of these the club in Berkeley. I'm pretty sure. After independent socialist clubs had been formed in several cities, a national conference was held in New York where they federated to form what was then called the Independent Socialist Clubs of America, ISCA. That conference was in 1966, end quote. Draper also commented on the sources of recruits for the new group. Quote, by the end of 1964, after the Berkeley campus Independent Socialist Club had developed very quickly, most of its members... One second. Sorry about that. Most of its members knew no more of the Socialist Party than did anybody else, but the politics which they studied was that represented by the literature of the Independent Socialist League before the collapse of the Shachtman leadership. This was even more true outside of Berkeley, where the independent socialist clubs developed. End quote. Draper concluded that by 1970 there were, quote, only a handful of active members who had once been in the Independent Socialist League youth group, ... and less than a handful of old members, ... who had been members of the Independent Socialist League, end quote. Joel Geyer, the longtime chairman and national secretary of the International Socialist, has indicated the nature of the activities of the group before its rechristening as International Socialist in 1969. Quote, our group was originally active in the civil rights movement, particularly CORE. I think CORE is the Congress of Racial Equality. I'm not sure if that's what the acronym stands for. The free speech movement in Berkeley, white-collar unions, and the anti-war and general New Left movements. Our group was quite small outside of Berkeley until 1967 when we established the Independent Socialist... I don't know, what is it called? Independent Socialist Clubs of America. As a loose federation of local clubs. At the same time, our Berkeley group played a large role in initiating the Peace and Freedom Party. We have for a long time been leading proponents of the idea of independent political action for movements of social changes leading eventually or hoping to crystallize the development of a workers' party in this country, end quote. Joel Geyer. 1 second. Joel Geyer has also commented on the areas of recruitment of the independent socialists in the 1960s. Quote, our growth was primarily due to our activity in the Peace and Freedom Party, and later when the SDS split, Students for a Democratic Society, split and dissolved, we succeeded in winning to our ranks the former Revolutionary Socialist Caucus of the Students for a Democratic Society. Significant parts of some Students for a Democratic Society chapters, particularly University of Chicago, Ann Arbor, Seattle, Madison, CCNY, etc., and some of its leading anti-Stalinist activists. The decision of those SDSers and of some members of the Revolutionary Workers Committee of Detroit to join the Independent Socialist Clubs of America led to our forming a national organization, end quote. Joel Geyer. At a convention in September 1969, the Independent Socialist Clubs became International Socialists. About that time, Draper withdrew from the group, using as his reason that what he interpreted as, quote, dual union, end quote, trends within the organization, that is, the tendency to center its labor activities on the organization of new unions competing with existing unions. At least some of his colleagues felt that this was Draper's excuse rather than his reason for withdrawing from political activity. As late as 1973, Hal Draper was associated with an independent socialist committee for which Draper wrote, quote, a position paper, end quote, attacking the sectarian tendencies of most American radical groups. The International Socialists held to the old ideological position of the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League. In its International Socialist program in brief, carried regularly in their periodical, it was stated that, quote, we believe that no existing regime can be called socialist. On a world scale, the, quote, socialist, end quote, countries constitute a system, ... with a common ideology and social origin. In place of capitalism, this system has achieved and now aims at not the abolition of class society, but a new type of class system, end quote. This document went on to say that where communist parties have taken power, quote, these movements have placed in power not the working class, but a self-perpetuating bureaucratic class. ... This system is no less class-ridden and in its fully developed form, as in the USSR, no less imperialist than capitalism, end quote. During the evolution of the autonomous independent socialist clubs into international socialists, there were several issues of controversy within the group. One of these was their position on the Vietnam War. They were opposed to United States involvement in the war from the beginning, but were hesitant about supporting victory for the Vietnamese communists. A typical earlier statement by the independent socialists appeared in their publication in its June-February 1967 issue, quote, as Americans, we particularly oppose the presence of U.S. troops in other lands and call for their immediate withdrawal so that nations like Vietnam may determine their own destiny. We look to independent democratic movements of workers and peasants as the alternative to the future communist rulers as leaders of the anti-colonial struggle, end quote. However, the founding convention of the International Socialists in September 1969 adopted a resolution which said in part, quote, the building of an independent democratic alternative in Vietnam would have been immeasurably easier if the imperialists had been driven out in 1945, 1954, 1963, or 1966. But American imperialism must be driven out in any case. At the present, that means it will be driven out by the Vietnamese under the leadership of the National Liberation Front. Our support for the military victory of the Vietnamese in that conflict in no way contradicts our political support for the fight of the Vietnamese working class and peasants against their new rulers, end quote. For a Trotskyist council communist perspective on the developments in Vietnam, and an insider's view of Stalinism in Vietnam, check out the work of No Van, which is spelled NGO space VAN. He wrote a book called In the Crossfire. I have it. I have not read it, but I've read some of his essays, and it's important to think about how the Trotskyist movement, which lost so many to repression in both China and Vietnam to the victorious Stalinists, how they relate to these anti-imperialist, anti-colonial struggles that are led by Stalinists. It's an important thing to think about. Trajectory of the International Socialists. With the establishment of the International Socialists, there were organizational and policy changes within the organization. The national office of the International Socialist Clubs had been in New York, and its periodical, International Socialist, had been published in Berkeley. The headquarters of both were transferred to the Detroit area, and the name of the group's periodical was changed from Independent Socialist to Workers' Power. After the establishment of International Socialists, there was a change in the general orientation of the group. I think Workers' Power might have been the precursor to might have been the group that did Against the Current. I'm gonna look that up real quick. One second. Yeah, I believe so. Or it was started by a group called Solidarity, which was a merger, apparently, of Workers' Power and other groups. After the establishment of the international socialists, there was a change in the general orientation of the group. Joel Geyer, the national secretary of the Independent Socialists, observed in 1970 that, quote, "In the past, we have been active mainly in the student, anti-war, and women's movements. Our emphasis in the next year will be on increasing activity in the working class. We argue for rank-and-file struggle organizations which can fight when and where the unions refuse to fight, caucuses of black and women workers, political action by workers' organizations, independent of the Democratic and Republican parties," end quote. Subsequently, the International Socialists succeeded in organizing rank-and-file groups from a number of U.S. unions. Their orientation in this work was severely criticized by other Trotskyist groups, notably the Spartacists, as being too limited in its objectives. The International Socialists made its own presentation of its trade union policy in a resolution on, quote, labor perspectives, end quote, adopted at its 1972 convention. Quote, "We proceed from the class struggle as it really is today and not as we wish the class struggle to be. We propose directions for the growing rank and file movement without making sectarian demands on that growing rank and file movement. Rank and file groups usually arise around a specific event, incident, or issue. It is the task of socialists and advanced militants to move the group in a broader programmatic direction. This is not done by putting forth a score of demands all at once. New demands and concepts should be introduced in a logical and relevant manner," end quote. The International Socialists would seem to be the socialist group which was most successful in establishing some base in the organized labor movement in the 1970s. Like several of the others, it, quote, colonized, end quote, its members in the trade unions, but unlike most of them, it succeeded in attaining some degree of influence in rank-and-file movements in a number of unions. One of the earliest opposition groups in which the Independent Socialist members had some influence was the United Action Caucus in Local 1101 of the Communications Workers of America. The Independent Socialists also were active in the West Coast International Longshoremen's Union, where an IS leader, Stan Ware, I didn't know he was IS, lodged a court suit against the union leadership when it sought to expel him. They were involved in the fight against the long-established leadership of the National Maritime Union and against the Boyle regime and the United Mine Workers, supporting the ultimately successful campaign of Arnold Miller. From time to time, the International Socialists organized regional conferences of rebel trade unionists. One in Oakland in January 1975 on building the rank-and-file movement was attended by workers from the Longshoremen, Teamsters, and various other organizations. The union in which the International Socialists had most success was the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. In the early 1970s, the Independent Socialists worked within the Teamsters Rank-and-File Caucus, which was organized around the issue of the misspending of the Teamsters pension fund monies by union leaders. Later in the decade, the Independent Socialists played an important role in another rebel group, the Teamsters for a Decent Contract. In the process of this struggle, they were able to recruit at least a few important rank-and-file Teamsters leaders, some if not all of whom subsequently abandoned the International Socialists in one of its several splits. By the late 1970s, the International Socialists were publishing a special periodical, Labor Notes, identified as the organ of the, quote, Labor Education and Research Project, end quote. This periodical, Labor Notes, carried news on the rank-and-file movements and in a variety of different unions. Yeah, the Labor Notes still exists. I believe it's the same organization. This periodical carried news on the rank-and-file movements and a variety of different unions. The, quote, project, end quote, also organized periodic, quote, labor notes conferences, end quote. That of April 1981 featured panels on the attack on labor and organizing, the fight back, new areas of organizing, the future of the rank-and-file movement, as well as 19 workshops on such things as, quote, local union elections, end quote, caucus organizing, end quote, reformers in power, end quote. Speakers included people from the 12 international unions, as well as such figures as the author Sidney Lenz. What the hell did Sidney Lenz write that I read? I think I read a Sidney Lenz book that was very good. It was about labor history. It's called The Labor Wars. Labor journalists Steve Early and Herbert Hill, professor and former labor director of the NAACP. Until 1977, the U.S. International Socialists formed part of the loose-knit International Socialist tendency. They were represented at a conference of the group in 1970. In 1975, they organized a successful tour around the United States for Neil Davies, a member of the National Committee of the British International Socialists, in connection with their fundraising campaign to convert their newspaper, Workers' Power, into a weekly. However, as a consequence of a split in the International Socialists in 1977, it ceased to be the U.S. affiliate of the international group. The general orientation of the International Socialist was indicated in the statement, quote, International Socialist, where we stand, end quote. Which appeared regularly in their periodical. Although its text changed from time to time in the light of passing events, its main emphases were consistent. Late in 1976, this statement listed the following under, quote, we oppose, end quote, quote, capitalist exploitation, capitalist control, oppression, capitalist government, and bureaucratic communism, end quote. Under the last heading, the statement said that, quote, Russia, China, and the countries with economies like theirs are also oppressive class societies run by a privileged ruling class of bureaucrats. They are not socialist and must be overthrown by the working class of those countries, end quote. Under the heading, quote, we support, end quote, the statement listed, quote, the rank-and-file movement, liberation from oppression. We support the struggles of every oppressed group to end its oppression, the struggle for equality and justice by blacks, women, gays, Latinos, Native Americans, and all oppressed people. Support from the entire working class movement will make both these struggles and that movement stronger, end quote. The statement listed, quote, socialism, end quote, as among those things supported by the International Socialists, saying that, quote, society should be run by the working class, the wealth produced by those who work go to fill people's needs, not to private gains, end quote. It also expressed support for, quote, workers' revolution and, quote, internationalism, end quote. It reflected its Leninist Trotskyist vanguard party, end quote, origins in support of a, quote, revolutionary party, end quote, with the explanation that, quote, the most class-conscious members of the working class have the responsibility to lead the struggle towards socialist revolution. To do this, they must build an organization to put their consciousness into action and make their leadership effective, end quote. The statement ended with the claim that, quote, the International Socialist is an organization of revolutionary socialist workers. We are open to all who accept our basic principles and are willing to work as a member to achieve them. Join with us to build the International Socialist into a revolutionary party, to build the movement to end exploitation and oppression, and to create a socialist world, end quote. The Revolutionary Socialist League. The International Socialists suffered... Oh, one second. The Revolutionary Socialist League. The International Socialists suffered several splits during the 1970s. The first of these took place in 1973, when about one-third of the estimated What's going on here? Sorry. Computer is being a son of a gun. It's being a all right. Back to what we're doing. The Revolutionary Socialist League. The International Socialists suffered several splits during the 1970s. The first of these took place in 1973, when about one-third of the estimated 300 members of the independent International Socialists broke away to form the Revolutionary Socialist League. Two principal issues appear to have been behind the criticisms of the independent socialist leadership by the dissident revolutionary tendency of the International Socialists, which was to form the Revolutionary Socialist League. One was the desire for a more explicit adherence to Trotskyism than that which the International Socialists had evidenced. The second more or less followed from the first, opposition to the downplaying of their revolutionary objectives in the day-to-day work of the International Socialist people in the unions. The International Socialists had certainly been never forsworn Trotskyism. In a book list they circulated in 1970, there were included 8 books by Trotsky, as well as Max Shachtman's The Bureaucratic Revolution. However, although the International Socialists did not formally abandon Trotskyism, neither did the International Socialists put major emphasis on Trotskyism. The International Socialist periodical had relatively little reference to the question, and Trotsky was not mentioned in the regularly appearing International Socialist Where We Stand, which appeared in each issue, although some of his basic ideas were expounded there. The revolutionary tendency went back to emphasis on Trotsky's ideas, particularly the transitional program. One of the principal documents emerging from this internal conflict was Ron Tabor's On the Transitional Program. In that paper, Tabor claimed the transitional program as, quote, the key to the agitation and propaganda of the revolutionary organization, end quote, and that it, quote, functions at all levels of struggle, from the education and training of the revolutionary cadres to the mobilization of the broadest masses by the vanguard seen this way, end quote. Tabor concluded, quote, the transitional program is not a manipulative tool to be whipped out on the eve of the revolution to mobilize the masses, as Comrade Joel Geyer argues, but the chief means by which the working class becomes conscious of itself, of its needs and interests, and struggles for its rule, end quote. This same document indicated the dissidents' disagreement with the International Socialist trade union policy. Ron Tabor, I assume it's Tabor. Is it Ron? Yeah, Ron. The same document indicated the dissidents' disagreement with the International Socialist trade union policy. Tabor wrote that, quote, in our agitational work, our job is to initiate and intervene in the workers' struggles around trade union, partial and democratic demands, seeking to relate these to class-wide demands, to fight within the labor movement for a fighting policy, addressing the needs of the class as a whole, ... and more generally to raise the demands and slogans of the transitional program, even when these may be unpopular, ... end quote. 1 second. Okay, is Ron Tabor? I think Ron Tabor might be a guy who went. There's a piece on here by Wayne Price, who talks about how a lot of people moved from Shachtmanite Trotskyism to anarchism, and I think Ron Tabor might be one of those individuals. I typed in his name in Google just now, and it said that it's a lot of it's from like anarchist websites. At the outbreak of this factional fight, the critics seem to have had the upper hand. In 1972, Cy Landy was chosen national secretary of the organization in place of Joel Geyer. However, the group around Landy tended to be unstable, and within a year, he was not only removed as leader of the International Socialists, but his faction was expelled from the organization. The Revolutionary Socialist League soon developed ideological differences with the organization from which it had emerged. Rick Miles of the Revolutionary Socialist League has written that, quote, "When we were formed as an independent organization, our politics could be described as a kind of orthodox Trotskyism, with the important exception of our analysis of the nature of Stalinist countries. We agreed with Trotsky's emphasis on building an international revolutionary party, his theory of the permanent revolution, his opposition to the popular fronts of the 1930s, his analysis of the Chinese and Spanish revolutions, and overall approach of the transitional program, etc." End quote. The Revolutionary Socialist League also differed from the International Socialists' position on the, quote, Russian question, end quote. The Revolutionary Socialist League no longer believed in the bureaucratic collectivism analysis of the U.S. International Socialists, although continuing to reject the idea that the Soviet Union and other Communist Party-controlled regimes were worker states. Rather, they came to the conclusion that those were, quote, state capitalist, end quote. Ron Tabor stated that the Revolutionary Socialist League position in an article, State Capitalism vs. Workers' Rule, which was published in the Revolutionary Socialist League paper, The Torch. He wrote that, quote, "By state capitalism we mean the social system that exists in the countries called, quote, communist," end quote. Russia, China, Outer Mongolia, Cuba, and the countries of Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and North Korea. These societies, despite what they are called and what their own leaders call them, are capitalist. All represent a form of capitalism in which major property is in the hands of the state and the state itself runs production on a capitalist basis, end quote. Ron Tabor elaborated upon the Revolutionary Socialist League's state capitalist definition. Under capitalism, Tabor said, quote, "The working class continues to sell its labor power on the market for a wage sufficient only to maintain it at subsistence. (Bracket) The fact that it is a monopolized market does not alter this fundamental capital-labor relationship." End bracket. The difference between what is paid and what is produced, surplus value, is appropriated by an alien class, and moreover, this alien class reinvests its surplus in such a way as to increase its power over and against the workers. i.e. it invests the surplus value predominantly in production of the means of production in order to further increase the surplus value gained from the production process, ... In other words, 1. The wage laborers are exploited by an alien class which buys labor power as a commodity at value. 2. Production is for profit, the collective profit of the state capitalist trusts. And 3. The fundamental dynamic of the system is production for the sake of accumulation. These are the basic laws of motion and relationship of classes that define capitalism. End quote. The Revolutionary Socialist League differed also from the International Socialists on its insistence on the need to rebuild the Fourth International. About a year after the formation of the Revolutionary Socialist League, writing in connection with the negotiations for possible unity with the Class Struggle League, which at that time was advocating a Fifth International, Cy Landy emphasized this point on behalf of the political committee of the Revolutionary Socialist League, quote, "The Pabloists and other assorted betrayers who presently parade as the Fourth International do not dispose of the same resources as did the Stalinist betrayers of the Third. The Pabloists and other assorted betrayers do not have the resource of state power anywhere in the world. The total domination of the Stalinists over the Third International forced Trotsky to abandon the number and organization in order to preserve the program. Such is not the case for Trotskyists today. To preserve the program is to preserve the number and our right to it." ... End quote. In spite of its expressed desire to reestablish a genuine, end quote, Fourth International, the Revolutionary Socialist League did not become part of any of the larger currents of international Trotskyism. Its only foreign counterpart was the Revolutionary Marxist League of Jamaica. Rick Miles has explained that, quote, "At the moment, we consider ourselves to be a companion organization of the Revolutionary Marxist League of Jamaica, which puts out a newspaper, Forward, and is very active in working class struggles in Jamaica. The Revolutionary Marxist League of Jamaica is the only left organization in Jamaica that is opposing both the JLP and the PNP in the upcoming elections in that country. Although the organizations are not formally, quote, fused, end quote, we both consider ourselves to be part of one international tendency," end quote. The ideas of the Revolutionary Socialist League continued to evolve. By 1985, a statement on, quote, "what we stand for," end quote, noted that the, quote, "Revolutionary Socialist League identifies itself in the tradition of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky, particularly the pioneering theoretical work of Marx and Engels, the conception of the party, the stress on the importance of national liberation struggles, and the anti-statism shown in the State and Revolution of Lenin, and the fight against Stalinism of Trotsky. But we also identify with the best of anarchism, particularly its libertarian spirit, ... Revolutionaries must be the vanguard in the fight for common decency and true freedom, ... end quote. The Revolutionary Socialist League was active in several different fields. One was the trade union movement, although the Revolutionary Socialist League was unable to develop units in as many unions as the International Socialists. Rick Miles has noted that since 1975, quote, "we have been active in the unions, particularly the United Auto Workers and the United Steelworkers. We have recently been involved in an organizing drive among Latin workers in a not-so-friendly relationship with the ILGWU in Los Angeles." Is it the Garment Workers Union? I think it is. Anyway, end quote. At the 1976 convention of the United Auto Workers, the Revolutionary Socialist League organized Revolutionary Action Caucus held demonstrations against the Union administration then led by Leonard Woodcock. Rick Miles has noted that the other fields of activity and propaganda of the Revolutionary Socialist League, quote, "we were very active in the movement to support the liberation struggle of blacks, people of mixed race, and Asians in South Africa in the period after the Soweto uprising. pronouncing that right. Not an expert on South Africa. We were involved in various kinds of prisoner support work. Our newspaper, The Torch / La Antorcha, or La Antorcha, has a substantial readership among prisoners, end quote. Miles went on, quote, in the past couple of years, we have been very active in the struggle against various Nazi and Klan organizations, ... We believe the Nazis, and particularly the various Klan groups, have actual and potential mass bases that are much larger than most people believe. This is to a great degree based on our view that world capitalism is now entering into a severe crisis on the order of the Depression of the 1930s, end quote, Rick Miles. Finally, Rick Miles noted that, quote, one particularly important area of our work has been in the gay liberation movements because, one, much of the left suffers from the same homophobia that characterizes society as a whole, ... We believe the questions of gay liberation give us important openings to raise our views on the nature of socialism. That is, it is a free society directly run by working class and oppressed people, not an authoritarian system run by a state capitalist class, and to convince people of our analysis of the Stalinist countries in which gays are very oppressed, end quote. In 1977, a minority faction of the Red Flag Union, a, quote, gay revolutionaries, end quote, group who came to agree with the Revolutionary Socialist League's, quote, state capitalist, end quote, position with regard to the communist-controlled regimes, joined the Revolutionary Socialist League. The majority of the Red Flag Union joined the Spartacist League, and the organization ceased to exist as such. Beginning in the late 1970s, the Revolutionary Socialist League sought to join with other groups which it considered to be, quote, revolutionary, end quote, to counteract the influence in organized labor in other fields of the, quote, reformist groups, end quote. Ron Tabor outlined this policy in an article in The Torch entitled Reform or Revolution, Key Questions for the Left, entitled Reform or Revolution, Key Questions for the Left. After first observing that superficially the, quote, U.S. left, end quote, seemed to be divided mainly between Trotskyists and Stalinists, Ron Tabor said that in reality there were great differences among the groups within those two alignments. There were reformists in both camps. Furthermore, a, quote, number of groups, both, quote, Trotskyist, end quote, Stalinist, seemed to share agreement on the need for violent revolution to overthrow capitalism, consider all or almost all the so-called, quote, socialist, end quote, countries some form of capitalism, and generally pursue more militant policies. In our view, these more left-wing tendencies include the PLP, the RCP, the Marxist-Leninist Organizing Committee, and ourselves, among others. This should suggest that the current lines of division on the left are, at bottom, artificial and false. To us, the most basic and most important issue facing the working class is the question, reform or revolution, end quote. Deriving from this analysis, Tabor presented his group's tactical line, quote, there can be no doubt that the differences among the tendencies of a vital importance to the workers' movement and cannot be ignored or glossed over. The Revolutionary Party can only be built through a determined political struggle over these questions. But we should not let the political struggle among the anti-reformist forces hinder the fight against the reformist any more than is necessary. While carefully pursuing... But we should not let the political struggle among the anti-reformist forces hinder the fight against the reformist any more than is necessary. While carefully pursuing the political debate among ourselves, the anti-reformist organizations should find ways to join forces in specific united fronts around concrete struggle against the reformists, end quote. There is no indication that the Revolutionary Socialist League was successful in organizing any such united fronts. Rick Miles has summed up the long-range perspective of the Revolutionary Socialist League, saying, quote, Our fundamental strategic goal is to build an international revolutionary party based on the Bolshevik model, i.e., before the Bolshevik Party was taken over by Stalin. Hence, our organization functions on the basis of democratic centralism, which, despite the contentions of both the Stalinist and the bourgeois critics of Lenin, is not bureaucratic. End quote. I'll take a break here. Splits in the Revolutionary Socialist League. The Trotskyist Organization of the United States. The Revolutionary Socialist League suffered several splits. The first of these divisions took place early in 1974 and resulted in the establishment of the Trotskyist Organization of the USA, TOUS. Ian Daniels of the Revolutionary Socialist League has noted that, quote, the, quote, Soviet defensist minority, end quote, split out of the Revolutionary Socialist League to form the, quote, Trotskyist Organization /USA, end quote, which publishes Truth and is affiliated to the Varga wing of the Fourth International. The Trotskyist Organization of the U.S. started as the communist faction of the Socialist Workers Party, split, entered International Socialists, then left Revolutionary Socialist League as above. It remains a degenerated worker state. It retains a degenerated worker state analysis. End quote. In 1975, the Trotskyist Organization of the United States absorbed the majority of the Class Struggle League, principally these people who were, in 1972, as the Leninist faction had split from the Socialist Workers' Party and then joined forces with a dissident Spartacist group led by Harry Turner. In May 1975, the Class Struggle League once more split into its constituent parts, ex-Leninist League and Turner Group. Mike Conrad of Trotskyist Organization of the United States has written, quote, the essential cause of the split in the Class Struggle League revolved around the fact that the comrades supporting the leadership recognized the necessity for a reevaluation of the question of the struggle to rebuild the World Party of Socialist Revolution, the Fourth International. Thus, it became necessary for these comrades to actively participate in this struggle and to rebuild the Fourth International. The only place this could be done was within the ranks of the International League. End quote. Shortly after liquidating the Trotskyist Organization of the United States, the former Leninist faction members issued, quote, a call to the militants of the Socialist Workers' Party, end quote, urging them to join the fight to, quote, rebuild, end quote, the Fourth International. This call argued that, quote, those militants of the Socialist Workers' Party who see that the primary task of the socialist revolution is to construct the vanguard party as on an international scale, an organized center against the bourgeoisie, Stalinism, and the liquidationist centrists, must assess and make a break with the revisionism and federalism that is the Socialist Workers' Party, USEC. As militants of the Class Struggle League who struggle within the Socialist Workers' Party and have subsequently joined the Trotskyist Organization of the United States, American supporters of the International League, rebuilder of the Fourth International, we call upon you to begin the struggle to build a faction within the Socialist Workers' Party to fight for the Fourth Open Conference of the International League, a conference at which the Fourth International will be rebuilt, ... end quote. The Trotskyist Organization of the United States remained one of the smaller groups in the United States claiming allegiance to Trotskyism. They seemed to concentrate most of their efforts on bringing out and distributing their newspaper, Truth, and magazine, Fourth International. They have been affiliated with the international faction headed by the Hungarian Trotskyist Balázs/Varga, which broke away from the Lambertists. The Revolutionary Marxist Caucus. Early in 1975, the Revolutionary Socialist League suffered its second split. Rick Niles has noted that, quote, late in 1974, a grouping formed inside the Revolutionary Socialist League that proposed that we retreat from virtually all practical organizing activity and instead study and write books. Although this was the main issue in the dispute, there were others of a more theoretical nature, including the nature of capitalism in the 20th century and the nature of the post-war prosperity period, end quote. This group, the Revolutionary Marxist Caucus, left the Revolutionary Socialist League without being expelled and maintained a separate existence for about 2 years. They then joined the Socialist Workers Party. Miles has noted that, quote, although the Revolutionary Marxist Caucus had defended the point of view that the Stalinist countries are state capitalist, in fact, the Revolutionary Marxist Caucus proposal to study and write was motivated primarily as the best means to fight for that view. The leadership in some, but not all, of the Revolutionary Marxist Caucus, rank and file, adopted the Socialist Workers' Party's position on the nature of these countries, end quote. The principal leaders of the Revolutionary Marxist Caucus were Bruce Levine, Landau, Eric Olson, and Aníbal Yáñez, son of a Mexican Trotskyist leader. I think it's Yáñez, Y, A with an accent, N with the little wave on top of it, E-Z. Maybe that's just another accent. Anyway, the only one of these to stay in the Socialist Workers' Party was Yáñez, who in the early 1980s was still writing about Latin American issues for the Militant. The League for the Revolutionary Party. The third split off from the Revolutionary Socialist League was the League for the Revolutionary Party, established late in 1975. This division was the most important one in terms of who participated in it. The major figure was Cy Landy, who had been one of the principal leaders of the International Socialist and a major founder of the Revolutionary Socialist League. The origin of this split, as seen from the point of view of those who stayed with the Revolutionary Socialist League, was explained by Rick Miles, quote, in this split, a group led by Cy Landy, was expelled for violation of discipline, actually systematic obstruction of the work of the organization. The political issues involved too. One was the question of the Labor Party. The Revolutionary Socialist League had accepted Trotsky's notion of supporting the call for a Labor Party, an independent Labor Party based on the trade unions in the United States. In 1975, Landy proposed to discard this position and replace it with a call for a general strike, in fact, an international general strike. Most of the Revolutionary Socialist League considered this proposal to be playing with words and rejected it. In addition to this dispute, there was another more fundamental issue that was actually the cause of the split. This was a proposal of the Revolutionary Socialist League majority to break from what we saw as a one-sided and abstract propagandistic approach and to get involved in various movements and struggles using a flexible united front approach. In other words, we proposed to get involved in struggles in which people were fighting for very basic things, what we called trade union and democratic demands, and to try to fight for our revolutionary views in the course of these struggles. The Landy group rejected this and accused the Revolutionary Socialist majority of abandoning Trotskyism, end quote. Cy Landy was expelled from the Revolutionary Socialist League on November 29, 1975. Cy Landy's associate, Walter Dahl, was expelled shortly afterwards. Most of their followers in the Revolutionary Party tendency stayed in the Revolutionary Socialist League a short while longer, but were expelled from the Revolutionary Socialist League on February 15, 1976. The group then joined forces to establish the League for the Revolutionary Party. The League for the Revolutionary Party people presented their version of their differences with the Revolutionary Socialist League in an article, The Struggle for the Revolutionary Party, which appeared in the first number of their periodical Socialist Voice. They proclaimed that, quote, the Revolutionary Socialist League is on the road to centrism, ... end quote. In explaining their differences with the Revolutionary Socialist League on the Labor Party issue, the League for the Revolutionary Party claimed that, quote, the Revolutionary Socialist League majority put forward an openly stagist view and accepted the limitation of the class struggle to bourgeois consciousness for the next period. Accordingly, the majority made its central political slogan the demand for a Labor Party in the United States, ... Whereas Trotsky hoped that the Labor Party slogan would intensify the struggle between the classes, the Revolutionary Socialist League's purpose is to accept a reduced level of struggle. Whereas Trotsky argued that it would be absurd and reactionary to advocate a reformist Labor Party, the Revolutionary Socialist League's Labor Party is designed for a democratic and trade unionist stage which condemns it to a reformist program, end quote. In discussing the general strike issue and the conflict, the League for the Revolutionary Party organ wrote, quote, thus the Revolutionary Socialist League opposed the general strike, accepting backward workers' mistaken understanding of objective reality is instilled by the labor bureaucrats. The Bolshevik understanding is that the world situation is objectively mature for revolution and is the workers' backward consciousness, their conservatism, fear, and sense of impotence that must be changed. The massive workers have a mixed consciousness, anger, and explosiveness run as a steady current just below the surface, ... To those who tail backward consciousness, the workers' response will come like a thunderclap out of the blue, as in France in 1968, end quote. The League for the Revolutionary Party remained relatively small. Its principal significance was perhaps the particular interpretation which it came to give to the, quote, state capitalist, end quote, definition of the Communist Party-controlled regimes. At its first national convention in October 1982, the League for the Revolutionary Party adopted a resolution defining its position on this issue. According to the official report on the convention, quote, in order to stress the uniqueness of the League of the Revolutionary Party's theory on the Russian question, the convention resolution adopted the name, quote, statified capitalism, end quote, for the Stalinist system, end quote. According to this same source, the League for the Revolutionary Party proclaimed that Stalinism, quote, is a weak patchwork operation clinging to Western technology and loans for survival, not a planned and powerful alternative in real contention for world domination. Stalinism's military might makes its economic fragility even clearer. Its bloc is shattered not simply for surface ideological differences, but because of economic necessity. Like the neo-colonial nations, Eastern Europe has achieved the minimal progress at the expense of huge debts to Western banks and a dependency on the world capitalist market. Russia is unable to guarantee or even partly satisfy its satellites' economic needs, end quote. The statement went on to note that, quote, these bastardized capitalist economies have been unable to uproot all the proletarian achievements made through revolution. They have been forced to try to turn those gains against the workers, and so they adapt the nationalized industry, foreign trade monopoly, and planning structure into instruments for exploitation. But these weapons also work against the efficient operation of statified capitalism, ... Thus, unlike in the 1930s, today Russia and its semi-empire are subject to the same economic crisis as world capitalism as a whole, end quote. The League of the Revolution for the Revolutionary Party document also stressed other aspects of the supposed similarity of the Soviet system to the Western capitalist systems. The statement argued that it was not in fact a highly centralized system with a unified ruling group, but rather was quite decentralized, with different elements in the system having fiefs which they control and battle for. In conformity with this, the return which members of the bureaucracy receive from the system, it was argued, depends on the way in which that particular part of the economy functions, again following the capitalist pattern. Finally, the League of the Revolutionary Party argued that the workers continue to be subject to the wage system, and the laws of capitalist accumulation, as analyzed by Marx, continue to apply in the Stalinist regimes as in any capitalist system. The League for the Revolutionary Party developed no affiliation with any international Trotskyist group. At their October 1932 convention, the League for the Revolutionary Party changed their principal slogan from, quote, reconstruct the Fourth International, end quote, to, quote, recreate the Fourth International, end quote, explaining that this was, quote, to avoid any implication of gluing together the present false claimants to Trotskyism, end quote. With the spring 1984 issue of their periodical, the RWL changed the name of the paper from Socialist Voice to Proletarian Revolution. Their explanation for this change was that, quote, the need for a new name was given immediately by the fact that although our program has not changed, the left as a whole has shifted markedly to the right over the past decade, ... The content of both quote, socialist, end quote, communist has therefore become linked even more compromising and mealy-mouthed dogmas than in the past. To sharply distinguish our goals and methods, we chose the name Proletarian Revolution. Above all, it reemphasizes the centrality of the working class and the impossibility of serious reform in this epoch of capitalist decay, ... end quote. More splits in the International Socialists. The International Socialist Organization. After the split in the International Socialists, which resulted in the formation of the Revolutionary Socialist League, the International Socialists suffered two further divisions. One of these took place in 1977 and seemed to have resulted from differences of opinion of the International Socialist leadership with its counterpart organization in Great Britain. The result was the formation of the International Socialist Organization, which became the U.S. affiliate of the International Socialist Tendency on a world scale. Although associated with one of the branches of the International Trotskyist movement, the International Socialist Organization and its monthly newspaper gave relatively little evidence of such affiliation. An issue of Socialist Worker, the International Socialist Organization organ, in early 1983 contained no reference to Trotsky or Trotskyism. Although the regular feature Where We Stand, in which the organization outlined its ideology and stand on various issues, containing a section on internationalism, that section contained no reference to the International Socialist Organization's international affiliation or to the Fourth International in general. The other parts of this statement of the International Socialist Organization's position included one on workers' control, which argued that, quote, a socialist society can only be built when workers collectively seize control of that wealth and democratically plan that wealth's production and distribution according to human needs instead of profit, ... end quote. Another call for, quote, revolution, not reform, end quote, and a fourth section called for, quote, a workers' government, end quote, indicating closer association with traditional Trotskyism, stating that, quote, the present state apparatus, ... cannot be taken over as it stands and converted to serve workers. The working class needs an entirely different kind of state based upon mass democratic councils of workers' delegates, end quote. The dissident Trotskyist origin of the International Socialist Organization was most closely reflected in the comment in Where We Stand, that, quote, Russia, China, Cuba, and Eastern Europe are not socialist countries. They are state capitalist and part of one world capitalist system. We support the struggles of workers in these countries against the bureaucratic ruling class, end quote. The International Socialist Organization had its headquarters in Cleveland. In April 1983, the 1983 issue of Socialist Worker indicated that the group had, quote, members and branches, end quote, in 24 cities, most of them in the Northeast, although San Francisco and Seattle were also listed. The presence of groups in such college and university centers as Bloomington, Kent, Madison, and Northampton would seem to confirm the observation that the organization had its principal strength on the campuses. Workers' power. The final split in the International Socialists came as a consequence of their work in the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Among the people whom they recruited in the process of their participation in succeeding rank-and-file opposition to the dominant and corrupt oligarchy in that union was Peter Camarata. For some time, he was the principal international socialist figure in the union. However, in the late 1970s, Peter Camarata split away to form his own group, Workers' Power, claiming that the International Socialists were not being sufficiently loyal to their own principles and were showing too much willingness to compromise in the struggles within the Teamsters. Workers' Power published a periodical, Against the Current. One of its themes was the need for, quote, all tendencies of ... the broad revolutionary left ... to unify despite their serious political differences ... end quote. In March 1985, it was announced that Workers' Power would soon merge again with the International Socialists. Conclusion. More than 45 years after the Shachtmanites split in the Socialist Workers' Party, there continued to exist in the United States several organizations which, although claiming basic allegiance to international Trotskyism, agreed with the original Shachtmanites that the Soviet Union and other communist-controlled regimes were not in any sense, quote, worker states, end quote. Like other elements of the Trotskyist movement, this tendency had splintered, and like the global international socialist tendency, its several factions disagreed on whether the Stalinist regimes were, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote, or, quote, state capitalist, end quote. Thanks for listening.